his questions. He didn't really have a hiding place when he was a kid, but there were 2 dressers in his parents' room that sort of formed a nook that he could hide inside. So he would go crawl inside there and hide from his parents in their very own room, which I think is a very clever way to do it. He's not a real candy bar fan, but he does love granola, which is, when you see John, it's hard to imagine he's a granola fan. He prefers showers to baths. Is it baths or baths? I'm going to say baths. Bathes? He bathes instead of showers. He showers instead of bathes. That's the way to do it, instead of baths. His boat, if he could name his boat, would be called Goodness Gracious, which is fun. And I asked, what's the one question you would want answered with a definitive answer? And he said, I would want to know, how do proteins fold? Awesome. Awesome. Please welcome to the stage, John Wathney.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and my special thanks to everyone who made this conference happen. I know it takes a lot of work. Thanks to Brian Palermo for giving me a very difficult act to follow, especially for an introverted nerd who's getting feedback. I also want to thank my friend Daryl Ray, who introduced me to the free thinking community here in Los Angeles. Daryl runs a charity called recoveringfromreligion.org, and you really should visit his website if you're having trouble with the transition from religion to free thinking. Okay. Anyway, speaking of that transition, I have a question for you. It's kind of a thought experiment about doing a global transition from religious to free thinking or skeptical thinking. How many of you think that if we could somehow get parents everywhere to stop indoctrinating their children with religion and instead teach them science and good critical thinking skills, if we had some way to do that, that religion and belief in God would just vanish within a few generations? Raise your hand if you think that would be the most likely outcome, if we had a way to do that. Okay, it's a little hard for me to see with the lights in my eyes, but I would say we have maybe, I don't know, a quarter of the people, something like that, saying yes. I will try to persuade you today that belief in God comes not only from indoctrination, but also from something intrinsic to human nature, something biological in origin, something that makes us prone to the illusion of God's presence. And my talk will be in 4 parts. And maybe we should have the slides up on this side. This will be a slide-intensive talk, unlike the previous one. In the first part of my talk, I'll try to show you through examples what I mean by the illusion of God's presence, a phenomenon that science has mostly overlooked. In part 2, I'll present some insights from the science of visual illusions that we'll need later in the talk. And you may wonder what any of this has to do with religion, but be patient. I think you'll see the relevance when we get to part 3, where I'll try to explain the illusion of God's presence as something intrinsic to human nature. Now, my hypothesis makes testable predictions, and we'll turn to behavioral biology and neuroscience for some insights and evidence here. Of course, any good hypothesis should have explanatory power. So in part 4, I'll try to show how it explains 3 long-standing puzzles of religion, one of which was pointed out by Neil deGrasse Tyson. So that's the map of where we're going. Now let's move on to part 1. I said that the illusion of God's presence is something that science has mostly overlooked. So to give you some context, I should first say at least a little bit about what science has studied about religion. And science has mostly explored those aspects that have to do with human social behavior. And of course, this is an extremely important dimension of religion. From that, we get things like belief in judgmental gods, greater cooperation within the in-group, greater hostility toward competing out-groups, rituals of sacrifice as proof of belief and loyalty, and group rituals that get believers moving and feeling as one. Now, in my book, I lump all of these things together into what I call the social root of religion. But the illusion of God's presence comes from somewhere else. In this painting, the artist depicts it in a visual way because that's kind of what artists do, but it's really not a visual hallucination. It's more a compelling feeling that someone else is nearby, coupled with powerful emotions. And I can best convey this illusion to you just by reading some first-person accounts. They tend to fall into two big categories, one of which comes on gradually and persists, possibly for a lifetime. And this may be just a vague feeling that the universe is somehow mindful and benevolent, or it could be kind of an ongoing sense of God's love and presence. Here's how blogger Andrew Sullivan describes it. I have never doubted the existence of God, never. My acceptance of God's existence, of a force beyond everything and the source of everything, goes so far back in my consciousness and memory that I can neither recall finding this faith nor being taught it. It is the air I have always breathed. And then there's the sudden and transient kind. Often these come in times of personal crisis or helplessness. And this particular example comes from a collection of thousands of such reports. Then, just as I was exhausted and despairing, I had the most wonderful sense of the presence of God. He was in a particular place in the room, about 5 feet from me. I didn't look up, but kept my head in my hands and my eyes shut. It was a feeling of an all-embracing love which called forth every ounce of love I had in me. It was the tenderest love I have ever encountered, and my sins were blotted out completely. So notice the powerful emotions there, and also the spatial specificity of the illusion, in a particular place at a specific distance. There's also typically an overwhelming feeling of knowing or sense of certainty that comes with these experiences, and this can be so compelling that some people take it as proof of God's existence. And one of those is Christian apologist William Lane Craig. I know Christianity is true on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit in my heart. This gives me a self-authenticating means of knowing Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. And likewise, Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, writes, why do we have a God-shaped vacuum in our hearts and minds unless it is meant to be filled? Well, you will all recognize this, I'm sure, as just a plain old God at the gaps argument. We don't understand these feelings. Science could never explain this. Therefore, God did it. And of course, the problem with this is that it doesn't really explain anything. It's untestable. It suggests no experiments. It's an intellectual dead end. Now, I'm not challenging the reality of the feelings. I've had those myself. But I just see them as a fascinating puzzle of human nature that cries out for a scientific explanation. Now, we'll get to that in just a few minutes, but first we need to take a look at visual illusions. Illusions happen when a neural model differs from reality. In the Ames room illusion shown here, the identical twins seem to be grossly different in size because the brain has an internal model of rectangular rooms with horizontal floors and parallel walls. Now, if you look into this room with both eyes, the illusion instantly vanishes because your depth perception reveals the true shape of the room, which is not rectangular. But as long as you look with only one eye, you'll see the illusion, even if you completely understand how it works. This is what psychologists, I don't know what I did.
It's pretty though.
Let's see. Sorry, does anybody know how to turn on? There we go. We're getting there. Excellent. Thank you so much. So this is what psychologists call cognitive impenetrability. When you look into the room with only one eye and you still see the illusion, even though you know how the illusion works. Our conscious understanding is not enough to penetrate the illusion. Now, this illusion comes from a different neural model. Is this a meaningful image or just some random blobs? I would guess that most of you are only seeing randomness here, but that turns out to be an illusion. There really is something here. Try it this way. And for some of you, it may help if I make it smaller. So I'll do that too. Does anybody see anything meaningful? Shout it out if you see something. Okay, people are seeing a face. Does anybody not see a face in this? Raise your hand if you cannot find a face in this image. This is a difficult, challenging one. It's a face in profile, and I'll try to help you a little bit. It's in profile looking to the left. It's mostly in shadow. The ear is there. Here's the mouth, the nose, and the eye is in shadow. So this is called a Mooney face, after psychologist Craig Mooney, who studied visual perception using images like this back in the 1950s. It's a grossly impoverished image, stripped of all color, shades of gray, and most spatial detail. Now, when I had it when I had it upside down, I was making reality differ from your neural model of a face, which evidently expects faces to be upright. But even now that most of you can see the face, you'll probably lose that percept if I turn it upside down again. And there's two important lessons here. One is that this is, if I can push the right button, one is that this is another example of cognitive impenetrability. We have trouble seeing the face when it's upside down, even if we know it's there. But if we turn it right side up again, which my puzzle, there we go, now it's right side up. So if we turn it right side up again, your internal model of a face will flesh out this impoverished picture, and you'll get this much more vivid percept of a face. So let's move on. Now, of course, if the image is not impoverished, it's easy to see upside down faces, and many of you will recognize this as Margaret Thatcher. Now, if you look at these two images for a while, you might notice a few slight differences between them, but overall they look similar. And that is an illusion. Here's what they really look like. Now, the only difference here is that the eyes and the mouth have been turned upside down in this image on the left, but that's enough to make her a hideous ghoul. And because Margaret Thatcher's was the first face to be abused in this way, the illusion is named in her honor. What this tells us is that there's a special purpose circuit in the brain for the holistic processing of upright faces. And our perception of the normality of a face and its emotional impact are absolutely dependent on that circuit. We are utterly blind to the ghoulishness of Margaret Thatcher's altered face if it's upside down. But what the illusion cannot tell us is whether this special purpose circuit is innately specified or is the product of experience. After all, we almost never see upside down faces. So maybe the brain is lousy at making sense of them because it just hasn't seen enough of them. So is holistic face perception innate or learned? Well, it turns out there's a way to find out. Twin studies are the gold standard for teasing apart innate versus learned aspects of perception. Identical twins share 100% of their genes, but fraternal twins only 50% on average. So if identical twins are significantly more alike with respect to face perception ability than fraternal twins, then that's strong evidence of a genetic contribution. Now, to be able to do this with face perception, we need some measure of face perception that gives us numbers. And luckily, there are some. I don't have time to explain these, but all you really need to know is that these are 3 sensitive tests of holistic face perception ability that give us numerical scores. And when these were used in a twin study, the study found a strong genetic contribution to face perception. Roughly a third of the variance in face perception ability across individuals comes from genetic factors. We even know where the circuit is in the brain, because if you damage the area shown in red here, called the fusiform gyrus, you get a syndrome of profound face blindness called prosopagnosia. And it's not the entire area in red here that matters. If you damage only these 2 little red spots, called the fusiform face area, that's enough to give you this face blindness syndrome. Now, it's a little misleading to call it face blindness because people who have it can still tell you they're seeing a face if you show them a picture of a face. But what they cannot do is tell you whose face it is, even if it's a famous person or a close family member. Also, the deficit is permanent. No other part of the brain can learn to take over the function of a damaged fusiform face area. But the astonishing thing about this is that face blindness is permanent even if the damage happens in a 1-day-old infant. This paper I'm citing here describes a teenage boy who, as an infant, suffered a stroke to the fusiform face area and when he was only 1 day old, and he ended up with profound and permanent face blindness, although his perception of non-face objects was much less impaired. Now, what's astonishing about this case is that infancy is the time when the brain is most plastic, when the function lost to local damage can most often be taken over by some other part of the cortex, but not if it happens in the fusiform face area. So what this means is that the fusiform face area is an extremely brittle, single-purpose, innately specified circuit for which no other part of the brain can substitute, despite the fact that this thing is a learning machine. So the whole purpose of the fusiform face area is to learn to recognize thousands of individual human faces over the course of a person's lifetime. So it's not like there's no synaptic plasticity going on in this thing. It's extremely plastic. All it does is learning. That's what it's for. But it's a highly specialized kind of learning. And that's the important lesson I'm trying to get across here. Highly specialized learning of this kind requires a foundation of innate knowledge. And that insight raises an interesting question. Could a newborn infant use any of this innate knowledge about faces? And it turns out they can, and they do. Newborn infants have some holistic face perception ability. They spend more time looking at an upright Mooney face rather than one that's upside down. They also prefer a Mooney face to a similar non-face image. And we know from a clever habituation test that they see these two images as the same, but they see these two as different. So now we're ready to tackle this, the illusion of God's presence and my explanation for it. What exactly is this? How does it compare to visual illusions? Why does it happen? When I try to answer those questions in terms of biology and evolution, I sometimes get the objection that religion comes only from indoctrination, so any kind of biological explanation must be wrong. So let's get that out of the way first. There are two lines of evidence that religion is partly a biological thing. One is the observation from anthropology that religion is a cultural universal, and the other comes from twin studies, our gold standard, which show that religiousness is significantly heritable. Roughly half the variance in religiousness across individuals comes from genetic factors. But why would natural selection favor this? Well, my short answer is that it doesn't. It favors something else that makes us vulnerable to this illusion. I think there's a completely natural explanation for the illusion of God's presence, one that has to do with the peculiar constraints of human infancy. I think the neonatal brain is expecting something godlike, but that something isn't God. And we can see a hint of what it really is expecting in the Moreau reflex. This is an infantile startle reflex that's thought to be a vestige from our primate ancestors. Now, as infants, they had to cling to their mother's fur, and whenever they were jostled or startled, they had to reflexively reach out and grab on tight. So I think you'll agree it bears a striking resemblance to Pentecostal prayer. This is just one of many examples of what I call the infantile or neonatal root of religion, which I think explains the illusion of God's presence. Now, in contrast to the social root of religion, the neonatal root is characterized by belief in a God of unconditional love, maternal compassion and caring, infantilism in religious feeling and ritual, intense spiritual longing, and the illusion of God's presence. This kind of religiousness appears to be a byproduct of selective pressures for the survival of helpless human infants. And I've formalized that idea as a hypothesis that has three parts. Part one is that a newborn infant has an innate neural model of its mother. Now, this is not a detailed image of a specific person. It's just a sense of the existence of some vague and amorphous primordial savior out there somewhere. And here are the essential elements of the model as I conceive it. A newborn infant knows that its mother exists. that she knows how to help the infant, that she's able to help, wants to help, and will help when she hears crying. Now, there's a little bit more to it than that. There's also some physiologically critical information about mother providing nourishment through nipples that can be recognized by scent and touch and taste, about her having a melodic voice, a feminine pitch, and about her having a face and some rough idea of what a face is and what it looks like. And on the left here, you can see what a mother's face does look like to a newborn infant with its still developing visual system. This is an impoverished image, a lot like a Mooney face. So you can see how it would be helpful for an infant to have some holistic face perception at birth. What I'm suggesting in this hypothesis is that they have more than that, especially in the cortex that will ultimately support social behavior in adulthood. But in infancy, it supports attachment to mom, the primordial savior. So that's part one of the hypothesis. Part two is that the circuitry that implements this innate model of mother persists into adulthood, but normally lies dormant. And part three is that the existence of this circuitry in the adult can give rise to the feeling of a loving presence, especially, although not necessarily, under conditions that mimic the helplessness of infancy. And these experiences are often interpreted in religious terms because a crude mother-shaped vacuum is easily misperceived as a God-shaped vacuum. Now, this hypothesis is consistent with what we know about the newborns and hatchlings of many vertebrate species. Having some kind of innate knowledge is the rule, not the exception. A good example are the herring gull chicks studied by Nico Tinbergen. They have an innate visual model of the parent's head and bill, especially that prominent red spot near the tip. They peck at that spot to solicit feeding, and newly hatched chicks will do this without any prior experience. Tinbergen discovered that the chicks would also peck at artificial models of the bill, and if he exaggerated thinness, redness, and contrast near the tip, he could make a stimulus that was even more effective than the natural one. And this is the classic example of what ethologists call a supernormal stimulus. In much the same way, I'm suggesting that God is a supernormal stimulus to the innate neural model of mother. God is a kind of superparent who answers prayers, is perfectly loving, omnipotent, and omniscient. These exaggerated attributes excite that crude model of a mother even better than a real mother does. And when it's excited, that innate sense of certainty of the mother's existence feeds the certainty of God's existence and the illusion of his or her sensed presence. Another useful metaphor here is the illusory phantom limb of the amputee. The phantom limb happens because the brain of an amputee expects the missing limb to be there. And that neural expectation creates the illusion. The patient's conscious knowledge that it's an illusion doesn't make it go away. So I like to combine both of these metaphors into one catchy phrase. In the light of biology, the God of unconditional love is a supernormal phantom, not a supernatural spirit. God is a supernormal stimulus in the ethological sense to the innate model of mother, and God's presence is a phantom sensation in the neurological sense, because the innate model expects a primordial savior to be there, just as the brain of the amputee expects the missing limb to be there. And this similarity of the phantom limb and the sensed presence is more than just a metaphor. Both the phantom limb and the sensed presence are illusions of embodiment, one's own in the case of a phantom limb, or someone else's in the case of a sensed presence. There's an interesting part of the brain called a temporoparietal junction that's involved in both of these illusions. And I think this is likely to be one of several places where the innate model of mother is implemented, but it's not the whole thing. If you stimulate this area with electric current, the subjects will sometimes experience the illusion of a sensed presence, but rarely with any kind of religious interpretation. The spatial and the personal aspects of the illusion are there, but the divine love usually is not. But those feelings of divine love may, however, come from this place. This is the orbitofrontal cortex, which I think is also likely to be an important part of the innate model of the mother. So on the underside of the frontal lobes, just above the eyes. Now, of course, it's what this orbitofrontal cortex does that makes it interesting. In monkeys, we know it's important for reinforcement learning. Neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex learn to become excited by a previously neutral stimulus, like, say, a green triangle on a computer screen, but only if it is paired with some kind of a reward, like a tasty treat. The tasty treat is called a primary reinforcer because it is innately rewarding, and the green triangle becomes a secondary reinforcer through learning. And by the way, the encoding of primary reinforcers in this part of the brain appears to be yet another example where innate knowledge is an essential foundation for learning. Now, we also know from neural imaging experiments that the orbitofrontal cortex is specifically activated in the brains of human parents when they see infants, and in infants when they hear their mother's voice. Now, of course, it's this last finding, and others like it, that are most relevant to my hypothesis of the innate model of the mother. But all of these findings taken together strongly suggest that the innate model of mother, or at least the part of it that's in orbitofrontal cortex, can be thought of as the set of primary reinforcers needed for learning social behavior. And that could explain why it persists into adulthood. It persists because it's an innate foundation for learning. Primary reinforcers like gentle touch, a smiling face, an affectionate tone of voice, all of those are innately rewarding and drive us to connect with others, not only in infancy, but throughout life. Now, probably the most compelling evidence for that idea is that damage to the orbitofrontal cortex in humans causes acquired sociopathy. Now, in this, cognitive abilities are normal. Things like mathematical ability, logical reasoning, memory, language, all that stuff is fine. The problem is that these patients can't feel the emotional consequences of reward and punishment. They lack gut feelings. Also, they cannot anticipate the consequences of their actions on other people, and so they are devoid of empathy. And these deficits lead them to make terrible decisions, although not usually rising to the level of criminality. But for example, they will lose their jobs, they make stupid investments, they go bankrupt, they get divorced, they marry prostitutes. In short, their lives fall apart. Interestingly, however, this syndrome is most severe when the damage occurs in infancy. As children, these patients are disruptive and impulsive in school. They're always getting in trouble for pathological lying, aggression, and stealing. They have poor hygiene and bizarre diets. They practice careless sex starting in their early teen years, and they make dangerously negligent parents. So what this tells us is that the orbitofrontal cortex is an extremely brittle, innately specified circuit for which no other part of the brain can substitute. Well, we have seen this movie before. This is what we saw in the fusiform face area. And like the fusiform face area, this innately specified thing is a learning machine. So this is all fascinating, and it says a lot about my hypothetical model of the mother, but does the orbitofrontal cortex have anything to do with God's presence? Well, it should if my hypothesis is right. But unfortunately, that's a really difficult experiment to do, because what you would most like to do is scan the brains of subjects in that critical moment when they're feeling that sudden and transient and intense kind of feeling of God's presence, which, as you might imagine, is a little hard to summon on demand. But if there's anyone who could do that, or come close to doing it, it would be these people, the Carmelite nuns of Montreal, who spend much of their time seeking closeness to God. Now, luckily for us, Montreal also has neuroscientists, and 2 of them recruited 15 Carmelite nuns to be subjects in a brain scanning experiment. Their neural activity in a mystical state was compared to that in a baseline condition, resting with their eyes closed. And in the mystical condition, the subjects were asked to remember and relive with their eyes closed the most intense mystical experience ever felt in their lives as members of the Carmelite order. And to give you some clue about what kind of mystical condition we're talking about here, I'd like to read you a short quote from the paper. During the qualitative interviews conducted at the end of the experiment, several subjects mentioned that during the mystical condition, they felt the presence of God, his unconditional and infinite love, as well as plenitude and peace. So that sounds a lot like what we're interested in here. What was going on in the brain? Well, the paper listed 14 areas specifically active in the mystical condition relative to baseline, but I will show you here only the top 5. And at the very top, the most active area is the orbitofrontal cortex, so that's encouraging. I don't have a specific interpretation for the next one, the middle temporal area, but the last 3 up there, in the inferior and superior parietal lobules, those are all in or near the temporoparietal junction. That's the area that handles embodiment and where electrical stimulation can sometimes produce the illusion of a sense presence. So I want to stress that this is only suggestive. It doesn't prove my hypothesis, but it is at least consistent with it. So now let's go over the main points real quick. Religion is partly a biological thing. There's a neonatal root of religion that science has largely overlooked. God's presence is an illusion in high-order association cortex that retains an innate model of mother. In the light of ethology and neuroscience, God is a supernormal phantom, not a supernatural spirit. And the hypothesis of the innate model of mother leads to testable predictions, and we saw evidence for one of those in the orbitofrontal cortex. Now, a good hypothesis may also explain some long-standing puzzles, and we have time to look at 3. Puzzle number 1, why is God two-faced? Why do believers tell you their God will damn you to hell, yet in the same breath insist that he loves you unconditionally? Well, you already know my answer to this. They're blind to this blatant contradiction because of powerful intuitions from the social and neonatal roots of religion, which tell them that both descriptions of God must be true. Now, if I'm right about this, if these really are the dominant sources of religious emotion, then this insight applies to more than just the two-faced God. It means that religion is in some fundamental sense two-dimensional. If we could mix the social and neonatal ingredients in the right proportions, we should be able to cook up just about any kind of religiousness there is. Or more precisely, if we could measure how much a person's belief comes from the social and neonatal components, then we could plot anyone in this space. Now, in my book, I present a rough draft of a psychometric test that tries to do exactly that. It has 34 items that assess the 10 qualities of religion in these 2 lists. And you should think of this as a prediction, because if the test were administered to many subjects of diverse religious backgrounds, then the social and neonatal items should naturally segregate into these 2 distinct factors in a factor analysis. Now, that experiment has not been done, but it should be. Puzzle number 2. Why are women more religious than men? This is probably the single most robust finding in the psychology of religion. Across nearly all religions, and by most measures of religiousness, women are significantly more religious than men on average. I think there are probably several factors behind this, but the idea of the innate model of mother suggests a new one, and I'd like to tell you about that. I call it the crosstalk hypothesis for the greater religiousness of women. And it has to do with something I showed you earlier in orbitofrontal cortex. You may recall that both adult caring for infants and infantile longing for mother come from the same neural circuitry. This strongly suggests that these 2 behavioral systems should be correlated. There's crosstalk between them. Individuals with greater empathetic caring as adults should, as infants, also have greater infantile longing for mother. And as adults, they should also have greater spiritual longing for God. But there's one more critical piece to this puzzle, and that is the observation that women are more caring and nurturing than men. This means that they should have greater spiritual longing than men, which would make them more susceptible to the illusion of God's presence, and therefore more religious than men in the neonatal dimension. And that last part is important because that makes specific predictions. Veneration of God as an infant should have relatively greater appeal for women than for men. On average, women will score higher on the neonatal dimension relative to the social than men. And greater nurturance or empathetic caring as a personality trait should correlate with greater religiousness of the neonatal kind, independent of gender. And I think we can see a fascinating example of that in Francis Collins. He became a Christian early in his career as a physician caring for cancer patients. It was his great compassion, not the infamous frozen waterfall, that brought him to Jesus. And that brings us to puzzle number 3. Why do elite scientists believe in God? Years ago, Neil deGrasse Tyson pointed to this puzzle and said there's something else going on that nobody seems to be talking about, something mysterious and alluring about religion that can seduce even the most brilliant of scientific minds. He cited these data from a paper in Nature. As of the late 1990s, roughly 90% of the American public believed in a personal God who answers prayer. For American scientists, that number is smaller. It's about 40%. But for elite scientists, members of the National Academy of Sciences, 93% of them reject belief in a personal God. That was the message of the paper. But Neil's point was that these authors had missed the most exciting and puzzling thing in their data. Namely, why isn't this number 0? Why do 7% of the most brilliant scientific minds believe in a personal God who answers prayer? Religiosity drops off with increasing scientific training, but it reaches a non-zero asymptote. And for some strange software reason, that 7% line is a little higher than it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be down at the top of the third bar there. But anyway, that's the asymptote. The question is why? And that was Neil's challenge. But he went on to argue that if we really want to understand religion, these are the people we should be studying, not the general public. Whatever it is that can make believers out of these folks must be the most concentrated essence of the thing we're trying to understand. So it won't surprise you to hear that my answer to this is that it comes from the neonatal root of religion. And what's seducing them is the cognitively impenetrable illusion of God's presence. And again, that makes predictions. Relative to the 93% of their colleagues who do not believe in God, this puzzling 7% should be enriched in women, physicians, and others who score high on tests of empathy and nurturance. And relative to those in the general public who do believe in God, this puzzling 7% should be enriched in people who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, which is really just another way of saying their faith comes mostly from the neonatal root. I'd like to close with one last description of the illusion of God's presence. This one experienced on the moon by astronaut Gene Cernan. We're in a good position now to make sense of it. I was literally standing on a plateau somewhere out there in space, a plateau that science and technology had allowed me to get to. But what I was feeling at that moment in time, science had no answers for. Because there I was, and there you are, the Earth, dynamic, overwhelming. And I felt that the world had just too much purpose, too much logic. It was just too beautiful to have happened by accident. There has to be somebody bigger than you and bigger than me, and I mean this in a spiritual sense, not a religious sense. There has to be a creator of the universe who stands above the religions that we ourselves create to govern our lives. Now first, notice how he rejects the God of the social root, not a religious sense, above religions that govern our lives. Also, we can see and hear the God of the gaps, science has no answers, and the argument from design, too beautiful to have happened by accident. But I take these things as really just conscious rationalizations for the powerful intuition that was really behind this experience. And here is that intuition, the certainty that there is somebody bigger. This, I suggest, comes from the innate model of mother. Science does have an answer for this. It hasn't yet been completely tested, but it explains a lot, and it is specific enough that it can be tested. You can learn more about this at my website, wathneyresearch.com, and of course even more in my book, The Illusion of God's Presence. And if we have time, I'll be happy to take questions.
Sharon Wathney, excellent. We have time for a few questions, yeah, indeed. And if you don't mind, I have the first question again. It's my privilege, I apologize. But this may be more of an anthropological question, but is there any way to correlate? Is there such a thing as a non-maternal society? I don't know if that even is a thing, but would they be prone to being less religious? Or children that are raised in paternal situations without mothers, or does the father sort of substitute the role of the maternal gap in the brain or the need in the brain?
Well, this innate model I'm talking about here is kind of a foundation for attachment to an attachment figure. And that doesn't have to be a mother.
Okay.
It can turn out to be another person. But what evolution has shaped the brain for, I think, is mainly for a mother figure, because for most infants, that's what it turns out to be.
Right. Who has a question? Anybody? We go right in the back here first. We'll go back and move forward.
I'm wondering, have you read any of the writings of Rabbi Sherwin T. Wine?
No, I'm afraid not.
Because this might be interesting to you, because he invented humanist Judaism. And his books are wonderful in more or less the way you've been describing. He talks about people praying. Why do people pray? Well, it's kind of like calling out for mother, isn't it?
Yes.
So as I said, he had a lot of these insights from more sort of a humanist religious perspective, but he was basically doing Judaism without God, in that's what his first book was titled. But that was my first introduction to this general idea of the neonatal model of God. But this might be an interesting thing, as I said, in general for people to read. So I was just wondering if you had.
No, I haven't, but thank you for raising that question, because the prayer is an amazing puzzle of religion. It could easily have been in my list there. I would have loved to talk about it, but there just wasn't time. But why do people pray to a God who already knows what they want? Most people believe in an omniscient God, so why do people do that? And that, I think, is the answer, that we have this innate need to cry out for help. I think prayer is kind of the adult manifestation of infantile crying.
One over here.
The praying and calling out. Have you read this rather bizarre but persistent thought? There's this paper that ends with "The Death of the Bicameral Mind" by Julian Jaynes back in the 1970s. If you haven't heard of it, just say no.
I've heard of that book. I kind of know what the essence of it is. I haven't read it, though.
Do people with face blindness tend to be less religious?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if that's been examined. It's a good question. I don't know.
Buddy? Another one? We have time for one more.
Have there been any genetic variants, SNPs, or genes discovered that correlate with this effect? And would an animal model be possible?
Oh, good question. I think there are some animal models, conceivably. I talk in my book about some. I mentioned a few, like the herring gulls, for example. There are others like that, and monkeys have been looked at, which are kind of a closer animal model to humans. So yes, I think there is room for exploring that in animal models. I don't know of any specific single point mutations that have anything to do with this. My guess is it's probably a multi-gene thing. Very many genes are involved.
I think we got one more back here.
So you had opened your talk with a question about whether, the audience feels that indoctrination, getting rid of indoctrination would get rid of religion.
Right.
So is your answer to that question yes and no, in that it'll get rid of the social portion but not the neonatal portion, and it would retain the spirituality?
Yes, basically yes. I don't think we would ever get rid of belief in God altogether. I think if we could stop indoctrinating children everywhere, I think there would still be these feelings, these intuitions that make people want to believe in something like a benevolent universe or a primordial savior. So I think it would keep bubbling up in some way, in some small fraction of the population.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. John Wathney, ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for him. Thank you so much.